In the past few decades, UK real house prices have soared. It means the average house price is over 8 times average income. A first-time buyer has to save over 18 years to get its first deposit. It's a source of great frustration for those caught on the wrong side of the housing divide. But also, what's the economic cost of an economy dominated by very high housing costs? The first impact of very high house prices and rents is the impact on living standards. If we need to spend 20, 30, 40% of our income on housing costs, it significantly reduces our living standards. Recently I did a video about stagnating wages in the UK economy. But it gets worse because not only have we got stagnating wages, but if housing costs rise, your effective living standards fall. It means you've got less to spend on other goods and services, affecting other businesses in the economy. It's led to the rise of NDIS, people in employment but without disposable income or saving. And a young person can be on quite a decent salary, but if you're paying high tax, a great student loan paying back and then very high rents, it leaves you very little disposable income. And so it shows that GDP stats can be misleading to how people actually feel. And this is a problem in the modern economy, a disconnect between the wage people get and their effective living standard. The other big problem of high housing costs is it's created this large wealth inequality. People who bought a few decades ago have seen very significant rises in wealth, but those who haven't bought face very high house prices, high rents, and difficult to save a deposit. It's also created something of an intergenerational divide because young people face this real barrier to getting on the property ladder. And what's become very important is whether your parents own a house and whether they can help you get a deposit. And this creates a sense of frustration for those who can't rely on family income or family wealth to help them get on the property ladder. And it's a real concern going forward because it is creating something of a divide in society. But there's other problems behind high house prices too. Thirdly, it can distort economic behaviour. Many firms, especially in high price areas like London and the South East, the Oxford-Cambridge corridor, say that it becomes difficult to employ sufficiently skilled labour because high housing prices are a barrier to moving there and getting a job. And this is particularly acute actually in the public sector. Nurses and teachers have seen a squeeze in real wages in the past decade or so. And combined with the rising housing costs, either rent or high house prices, it means that many schools find it difficult to employ sufficient teachers in areas of high house prices. Now, there's many reasons for the UK's poor economic growth in recent decades, but the housing market and the difficulty in moving, the difficulty in buying are definitely a constraint towards enabling growth in the areas where the economy wants to expand. Another big problem of high housing costs is that ultimately it increased the government costs. With rising rents, we saw a surge in the cost of UK housing benefit. It reached a peak of around £25 billion. And this is an effective subsidy to the private sector because we have lack of social housing, and so we have to subsidise the private sector where there's a shortage and prices have gone up above inflation. And the government was so concerned about the rising cost of housing benefit, they started to cap it. But this in itself caused problems of rising child poverty and also a rise in homelessness. The UK is now one of the highest rates of homelessness in the OECD. And this results from a very high rent plus withdrawal of some government subsidies. And this homelessness itself has quite a high cost to the government and local councils because many people are forced into temporary accommodation, which is quite expensive to pay. So there's kind of a circular problem, a lack of housing, pushing up prices, creating homelessness, and causing all this extra government spending on benefits and dealing with the problem of homelessness. Another impact of very high house prices is actually the change in household formation. If you're still living with your parents when you're in your 20s and 30s, it's because of the nature of the housing market. And perhaps parents themselves are not so enamoured of having their children live with them for much longer than before. But the very high cost of housing is kind of forcing people to change how they live. And that's affecting our individual freedom and ability to move on and start a life without people been able to stay in the extended family, the housing crisis in a way would be worse, because the changes to household formation are limiting demand. There's like a lot of suppressed demand in the UK housing market. Another issue was with regard to gentrification. Rising house prices, especially in former working class areas, are causing people to be squeezed out of the housing market there, changing the nature of an area and really negatively affecting those who might have lived there for many decades. Another impact of very high house prices and rent is that it's changing where we invest money. In the 2010s, when house prices were soaring and very high, we saw a big rise in the value of mortgage lending. Because house prices are so high, people took out bigger mortgages, and banks were willing and able to lend for mortgaging. But the problem is that although mortgage lending quadrupled, business investment, investing in new capital and new infrastructure, has actually been quite low. And so you could argue that the nature of a housing market is that it's taking investment from more productive areas in, say, manufacturing and the service sector to paying quite high mortgage payments. Also, the nature of the UK housing market, the high house prices and attractiveness of the housing market, has attracted a lot of foreign money influx. Research from King's Business School claims that without foreign investment in the UK housing market between 2000 and 2014, house prices would be 19% lower than they are now. Now, that might be debatable, the extent to which foreign money affects UK house prices, but it's definitely a factor. A final impact of very high house prices is that it changes our way of saving. Housing is seen as a form of wealth and pension for old age. So rather than, say, saving in banks and in pension funds, we see houses as a surrogate form of savings. Yet, rising house prices, even if you own a house, the rising wealth is not as attractive as it may first appear, because even if your house price goes up in value, you may have more wealth on paper, but it doesn't mean much if you had to sell it and then had to buy a new house or pay very high rent. So that's a limit of what housing can actually do. But while some use their housing as a form of saving for retirement, on the other hand, we have an increasing cohort of people who are privately renting, who have no housing wealth, but limited pensions. And this creates something of a time bomb for the future, that when this cohort of private renters reaches retirement, they face very high market rents, but without any housing wealth to tide them over and help them through retirement. So these are the problems of high house prices. But how do you go about fixing it? Is it likely that house prices will become more affordable? Well, I think to make housing more affordable, a few things need to happen. Firstly, we need a sustained increase in housing supply, and the government have a target of 300,000. And the problem is that even if the new government were really committed to changing planning regulations and boosting housing supply, it's going to take a long time because there's very low momentum in the house building sector. Lack of planning targets have really reduced house building, and with a shortage of skilled staff and firms don't see it as particularly profitable, they've been holding back. And an independent report suggests that it will take until 2030 at least before a new government actually reached its target of 300,000. And even building new houses is not a magic bullet. Definitely it will help limit price rises and reduce prices over the long term, but it's not going to be a quick turnaround. At least in the short term, what would help a lot is for interest rates to stay around about where they are now, around 5%. But if interest rates were 4 to 3%, as the IMF are hoping that the UK does later in the year, then that would definitely change the dynamics again of the housing market, because it makes it more affordable for people to get a big mortgage, and that again could see rising demand. Not particularly good news. Another factor that it could help is lower population growth. The UK has seen a really big increase in the population in the recent 10, 15, 20 years, with high immigration a contributing factor. Another thing that would help reduce unaffordability is a sustained period of rising real wages. I mean, it's interesting that actually real house prices have fallen in the past 15 years. Not many people know that, but hasn't seen an increase in affordability because wage growth has been so low. And if wages do rise, then that would help people to be able to buy, but also probably push up prices too. So in the long term, you definitely need a sustained increase in supply, changing planning regulations, building houses where they're really needed. But that's going to take quite a long time. And there's no easy solution to affordability. Things like rent controls might sound good in practice, good in theory, but there's a practical limitation that if you limit rents, then landlords may retreat even more when we already have a shortage of rented properties. So it's a difficult situation, no easy solutions, but it is a real big social and economic problem and something that needs to be changed for the long-term success and performance of the economy. Anyway, what's the prospect for house prices to fall in the next few years or so? And this video goes into more detail why at least the end of a long housing boom is probably over. The end of easy wealth gains is coming to an end, because it's hard to see a very significant rise in real prices, at least at the moment. Anyway, this video goes into more detail to explain why this might be the case.